So what is a watercolour bloom, and how do you both avoid them and create them? Well, that's what this video is about. Watercolour blooms are sometimes called backruns, blossoms, or cauliflowers. Now, whatever you call them, they can be both a source of frustration and a source of joy. In this video, I'll show you what they are, I'll demonstrate why they occur, I'll tell you how to avoid them, and I'll show you why I love them and how I use them in my own watercolour paintings. So what are they and why do they occur? A watercolour bloom is a strange, curvy shape with dark edges that appears on your paper and you don't know how it got there. You've probably seen them. They look like this. You can see how that bloom runs up the middle of the shape there. One way they might form is when you paint a wash on the paper. Sometimes you're left with an excess puddle of paint at the bottom of the wash, particularly if you paint on an angle. If you leave that puddle there, watch what happens. So I've just got a scrap piece of watercolour paper here and I'm just going to paint some Winsor Violet onto it. Just to create a wash here. It's fairly watery, but it's got a fair amount of pigment in it. So I'm just painting on the dry paper. Just painting a wash on like I normally would. I'll just put a bit of extra paint there so that you can see what I'm talking about. So what happens is you have a bead that forms along the bottom of the wash. So you can see it along the bottom there. So we watch this on time lapse, and that excess moisture and paint there flows back into the drying wash there and it creates that watercolour bloom that you can see up here. So this time I'll show you how to avoid that from happening. So I'm on the same piece of paper here and I'm using the same colour. It's still fairly dark. Just painting on the dry paper here. I'll put some extra paint on there, just like I did on the other one. Now I'm painting on a slight angle here like I did with the other one. And you can see that bead of paint forming at the bottom there of my wash. So what I have to do now is wash my brush out, take the excess moisture out of it and use it like a sponge. Just to sop up that excess paint that's there, that's beading at the bottom. So I just take that off with my brush. I may have to put a little bit of paint back on if my brush takes off too much. So we'll just see how this one dries now. So I've just got it on time lapse here and you can see that there's no watercolour bloom forming. Another way they might form is when a wet wash is flooded into another drier wash. Now the wetter wash rushes into the drier wash and it dislodges some of the drying pigment, and then the pigment particles collect at the edge of the wash as it dries and it creates this organic shape with a dark edge. So I'm just going to paint a wash on this scrap piece of paper, just like I did with those rectangles before. This is a piece of Arche paper, it's hot pressed. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to dry. You can see how shiny it is here. So it's very wet. It's got a glossy surface. So if I just let that sit for a little while, the sheen will go off the surface and it'll start to dry. So here it is. It's not completely dry. It's lost a lot of its sheen. It's still got a bit of a sheen, but nowhere near as much as it did have. So now I know that it's drying. So if I paint a wash up against this one while it's still drying, what happens is the pigment in this wetter wash rushes into that drier wash and it just displaces all the pigment, and then you get that bloom forming. You can use the same colour or you can use a different colour, it still happens. So I'll put this on time lapse as well, and you can see how it forms. So you can see how that wetter wash is rushing into that drier wash, and it's just displacing all the pigment, and it creates that bloom up the middle there. So how do you avoid them? Well, to avoid them, you need to be aware of the level of moisture on the paper and in your brush. If you add more paint or water to an area that's already starting to dry, then you're going to get a bloom forming like you saw in the example. So if you don't want a bloom to form, you need to leave the wash alone if it's starting to dry. You'll know it's starting to dry because it won't be as shiny as it was when it was wet. If the sheen is starting to dull, don't touch it. Don't put any paint up against it, because if you do, then you're going to get the blooms forming. You need to wait until it dries completely, and then you can re-wet it and paint over it and do whatever you want to it. To many beginner watercolour painters, these blooms can be an endless source of frustration. But to me, they're just another one of the qualities of watercolour that I love. I create blooms deliberately on many of my paintings, and I think they are beautiful and they add so much interest to your painting. I think they shout at the viewer and they say, "Hey, look over here, I'm a watercolour painting and I'm proud of it." Let me show you how I create them deliberately. So I just put my paint on the paper, just like I did in the previous examples. And once I've got it the way I want it, I have to let it sit for a little while and dry. So here you can see the sheen on the paper. You can see that it's quite shiny, so that means it's still quite wet. So you can see the sheen here. So I have to let that sit for a while and start to dry. So here you can see that the sheen on the paper is starting to dull a little, so I know it's starting to dry. If we put them side by side, you can see the one on the left is quite wet and the one on the right starting to dry. So now that I know this is drying, I can use some clean water and just drop that onto the drying paint. And you can see how that water rushes in and disturbs that pigment. And you can also do this with paint. You don't have to do it with water, you can do it with another colour. So you can see how that drying pigment is being disturbed by the water there. And this is what it looks like after it's dried. I've got a few of my paintings here that I can show you where I've created deliberate blooms. This fox painting is one of my classes on Skillshare, and these blooms here were created deliberately to create texture on the fur. So I'm just washing in the head here. I'm working on cold press paper. Just dropping in some other colours into that wet wash. I've done a bit more now. The paper's just starting to dry. I'm just going to give it a helping hand here with my hairdryer. I'm just going to dry it off just a little bit more. It's not going to completely dry. And then I can drop some water in just to disturb that pigment while it's drying. And that creates those blooms there and creates texture on the head of the fox. I finished this sea turtle painting this week. After I washed in the background, I looked for some areas that were drying, and then I dropped some water onto those areas to create these little blooms here. There's one up here, and another one under the chin here, and over here under the belly. The full-length step-by-step version of this painting is available on Patreon now. The link is in the description of this video. On YouTube here, I've got a video where I paint our beautiful Dalmatian, Now I painted quite a few watercolour blooms on her as well. So here I'm just finishing off some spots on her snout, just painting on the dry paper here. And what I want to do is just disturb those spots there with some water on my brush. So they're just starting to dry. If I just put some water there, that water rushes in and just disturbs that pigment. And then I get a bloom forming on those spots, and you can see how it's dried here. So here I've painted these ones over here. They're drying now, and I'm just working on another section. Now I can come back to this area and drop some water in. And that just disturbs that pigment, creates those blooms, and just makes the painting more interesting to look at. I've got some rose paintings hanging in my daughter's old room where I've added some watercolour blooms on the splash that I put on the backgrounds. I'll show you those. So here they are hanging on the wall in the spare bedroom. So I'll just speed this area up where I'm painting the background. I'm just painting on wet paper here. Just creating a splash on the background. And then I leave that to dry just a little bit, just to take the sheen off the surface. While that's drying, I can come over here onto this side, do a bit of work over here. And when I know they're starting to dry, I can come back to them and just drop some water on there. So you can see that water rushing in and disturbing that pigment. So I can put these water droplets wherever I like. I can put as many or as few as I like as well. Now if the wash had dried and I did this, nothing would happen. And also if it was sopping wet and I did this, nothing would happen, because it's just so wet that the water doesn't make much difference. So you've just got to wait until that sheen goes off the surface of the paper. It just starts to dull. And then you can create those watercolour blooms. So I'll just show you what they look like when they're dry. You can see those blooms up there. And on this one, you can see the big watercolour bloom down here. And also on the leaf over here, I've done one as well. I've also got a painting hanging on the wall in our TV room behind me here. It's got some deliberate blooms painted on it as well. I'll show you that one too. So this little wood duck here, I'll move in closer so you can see it. So here on these feathers here, I've created some watercolour blooms. You can see it on the black one here and on the blue one, and on some of these feathers down here near its tail. I've also got some here over on the body as well. So I just dropped the water in there while it was drying. So although they might frustrate you and they might occur when you don't want them to, if you can learn to control them, they can be used to create some beautiful effects on your paintings. Just let me know in the comments if you create watercolour blooms deliberately to enhance your paintings. I hope this video has been helpful to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.